The Boeing 777 lurched violently to the left, throwing Sarah Chen against the cockpit door with enough force to bruise her shoulder. Through the small window, she watched her husband Marcus slump forward over the controls, blood trickling from his nose onto the instrument panel. Captain Rodriguez was already unconscious, his head lolling at an unnatural angle against his headrest. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence," came the strained voice of flight attendant Janet Mills over the intercom, though Sarah knew this was far more than turbulence. The acrid smell of smoke was beginning to seep through the cabin, and the aircraft's altitude was dropping at an alarming rate, according to the glowing red numbers on the altimeter. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sarah had accompanied Marcus on this routine flight from Seattle to Tokyo Pacific Airways Flight 447 because it was their 10th wedding anniversary, and she'd wanted to spend the layover exploring Shibuya together. She was just the co-pilot's wife, armed with nothing more than a liberal arts degree and 10 years of listening to Marcus explain aviation procedures over dinner. But as she watched the Pacific Ocean rushing up toward them through the windscreen, she realized she might be the only conscious person on this aircraft who had any chance of understanding these controls. The passenger cabin behind her erupted in screams as the plane dropped another 1,000 feet in seconds. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for Marcus's headset, her mind racing through fragments of conversations about hydraulic systems, backup generators, and emergency procedures. She had exactly 90 seconds before they would be too low to recover from this dive, and 247 souls aboard were depending on a woman who had never even taken a flying lesson. The radio crackled with urgent voices from Seattle. "Center, Pacific 447, respond immediately. Pacific 447, you are descending below your assigned altitude. Respond." Sarah keyed the microphone with shaking fingers. "Seattle Center, this is Pacific Flight 447. We have an emergency. Both pilots are unconscious, and I need help immediately." The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity as the ocean grew larger in the windscreen and the aircraft's warning systems began their electronic symphony of impending disaster. 6 hours earlier, Sarah Chen had been worried about nothing more serious than whether her new burgundy dress would wrinkle during the 14-hour flight. She stood in front of their bedroom mirror in their Bellevue home, adjusting the neckline while Marcus finished his pre-flight routine in the bathroom, the same ritual he'd performed before every flight for the past 15 years. "The weather's perfect all the way to Tokyo," Marcus called through the bathroom door, his voice echoing off the tiles. "Clear skies, minimal headwinds. Should be one of those boring flights where the biggest excitement is choosing between chicken or beef for dinner." Sarah smiled at her reflection. At 34, she still felt like she was playing dress-up when she prepared for these international trips. Her background in art history from the University of Washington hadn't exactly prepared her for the world of commercial aviation, but she'd learned to navigate it through a decade of marriage to Marcus. She understood the basics. He was the first officer. Captain Rodriguez was the pilot in command, and together they flew the most advanced aircraft in Pacific Airways Fleet on some of the longest routes in the world. "Remember when you used to get nervous about flying?" Marcus emerged from the bathroom, adjusting his tie with practiced precision. His dark hair was graying at the temples, a recent development that Sarah found distinguished rather than aging. At 41, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had logged over 8,000 flight hours without a single incident. "That was before I married a pilot and learned that the most dangerous part of flying is driving to the airport," Sarah replied, though she still felt a flutter of anxiety before takeoff. It wasn't fear of flying exactly, it was the helpless feeling of being a passenger in a machine she couldn't control or fully understand. Marcus moved behind her, adjusting his four-stripe epaulets in the mirror. You know, most pilot wives don't come on trips anymore, especially not the long hauls to Asia. Most pilot wives aren't married to men who work for an airline generous enough to offer companion passes, Sarah said, leaning back against his chest. Besides, it's our anniversary. 10 years of putting up with your terrible jokes and your obsession with weather patterns. Terrible jokes? My jokes are legendary in the crew lounge. That's because you're trapped together at 37,000 feet. Captive. Audience. They had this conversation before every trip, a comfortable routine that acknowledged both the benefits and peculiarities of their lifestyle. Marcus's schedule meant he was gone for 4 or 5 days at a stretch, but it also meant long stretches at home and the opportunity for spontaneous international adventures when Sarah could arrange time off from her job at the Seattle Art Museum. Drive to SeaTac was routine, early morning traffic, the familiar route through Tequila, the employee parking lot where Marcus's Toyota Camry sat among dozens of other sensible sedans and SUVs owned by airline personnel. Sarah had made this drive so many times she could navigate in half asleep, which she essentially was at 5:30 a.m. "You nervous about flying with Rodriguez again?" Sarah asked as they walked through the crew security checkpoint. She'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated Marcus's comfort level with different captains. Some partnerships were seamless. Others required more careful navigation. "Alejandro's solid," Marcus replied, but his tone suggested some reservation. 22 years with the airline, clean record, he can be intense sometimes. Very by the book, which isn't necessarily bad. Captain Alejandro Rodriguez was waiting in the crew briefing room when they arrived, a compact man in his mid-50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of mustache that had gone out of style everywhere except airline cockpits. He looked up from his weather charts as Marcus entered. "Marcus, good to see you. And Mrs. Chen, welcome aboard." Rodriguez's English carried the slight accent of his native El Salvador, though he'd been flying for U.S. carriers for over 2 decades. "Beautiful day for flying. The routing takes us over some spectacular scenery. If your wife enjoys looking out the window, she'll want to get a seat on the left side once we pass the Aleutian Islands." Sarah appreciated pilots who acknowledged her presence rather than treating her as an inconvenience. Some of Marcus's colleagues seemed to view family members as potential security risks or distractions from the serious business of aviation. The passenger boarding process was the usual controlled chaos. Sarah found her seat in the first-class cabin, a perk of her companion pass, and watched the familiar dance of flight attendants preparing for departure. Janet Mills, the senior flight attendant, had worked with Marcus before and stopped to chat. "Another anniversary trip?" Janet asked, checking Sarah's seatbelt out of habit. At 58, she'd been flying international routes since the era when passengers dressed up for air travel and smoking sections were still a thing. 10 years, Sarah confirmed. "Marcus promised me sushi from the actual fish market in Tokyo, not some American interpretation. Tsukiji market is incredible. Just be prepared for the 4 a.m. start time if you want to see the tuna auctions." Janet moved on to check other passengers, but Sarah caught fragments of conversation about crew schedules, passenger loads, and the logistics that made international air travel possible. She developed an appreciation for the complexity of the operation over the years, the coordination required between pilots, flight attendants, ground crews, air traffic controllers, and dozens of other professionals to move 247 people safely across the Pacific Ocean. The departure itself was routine. The pushback from the gate, the taxi to runway 16 left, the powerful thrust of the General Electric engines as they accelerated down the runway. Sarah always felt a moment of wonder during takeoff, watching the world shrink below them as Marcus and Captain Rodriguez worked through their climbing checklist with practiced efficiency. Once they reached their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, Sarah settled in with a book, a biography of Frida Kahlo she'd been meaning to finish. The steady hum of the engines and the gentle rocking motion of the aircraft made her drowsy despite the early morning departure. She dozed intermittently, vaguely aware of the meal service and the steady progress of their flight path on the seatback monitor. She woke as they crossed into Canadian airspace, the northern Pacific stretching endlessly beneath them. The afternoon sun streamed through the cabin windows, and most passengers had settled into the quiet rhythm of a long international flight. Some watched movies on their personal devices, others slept. A few worked on laptops or tablets. Sarah made her way forward to the galley, where Janet was preparing the crew's meal service. "How are the boys doing up front?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the cockpit. "Smooth as glass. Your husband's explaining something about wind patterns to Captain Rodriguez. You can probably hear them from here if you listen carefully." Sarah could indeed hear the murmur of professional conversation from behind the cockpit door. Marcus had a gift for explaining complex meteorological concepts in terms that made sense to other pilots, even those with decades more experience. It was one of the things that made him such an effective first officer, his ability to communicate clearly and work collaboratively with different personality types. "Mind if I peek in?" Sarah asked. "I promise not to touch anything important." Janet glanced around the nearly empty first-class cabin. "I don't see why not. They're probably ready for some company anyway." The cockpit of the Boeing 777 never failed to impress Sarah with its complexity. Hundreds of switches, displays, and indicators covered every surface, each one serving a specific function in the operation of the aircraft. Marcus sat in the right seat, the first officer's position monitoring instruments and communicating with air traffic control. Captain Rodriguez occupied the left seat, his hands resting lightly on the control yoke. "Hey there," Marcus said without turning around, somehow sensing her presence. "Enjoying the flight? It's beautiful up here. The sun on the clouds looks like something out of a painting." "We're making good time," Rodriguez added. "Should arrive in Tokyo about 20 minutes early if these tailwinds hold up." Sarah positioned herself carefully behind Marcus's seat, where she could see out the windscreen without interfering with any controls. The view was spectacular: endless blue sky above, a carpet of white clouds below, and the curve of the earth visible at the horizon. "What's that island?" she asked, pointing to a small landmass visible in the distance. "Attu Island, the westernmost point of Alaska," Marcus replied. "We'll be entering Russian airspace in about an hour, then across Siberia before turning south toward Japan." "Russian airspace? That sounds ominous." "It's routine," Rodriguez assured her. "We file our flight plan weeks in advance, and the Russians charge us a hefty overflight fee for the privilege of crossing their territory. Much more efficient than trying to fly around it." Sarah spent another 10 minutes in the cockpit, listening to Marcus and Rodriguez discuss fuel consumption, weather updates, and the subtle adjustments required to maintain their flight path across one of the world's most remote regions. Their professional competence was reassuring. These men had flown this route dozens of times, and every aspect of the flight was unfolding according to plan. As she prepared to return to her seat, Sarah noticed Rodriguez rubbing his temples and blinking more frequently than usual. "Headache?" she asked. "Just tired. These ultra-long-range flights take it out of you, even when everything goes smoothly." Marcus glanced at his captain with mild concern. "You want me to take over for a while? I'm fresh. I'm fine. Just need some coffee and maybe an aspirin." Sarah returned to her seat with a vague sense of unease she couldn't quite identify. Both pilots looked tired, which wasn't unusual on a flight of this length, but something in Rodriguez's expression had seemed strained. She told herself she was being overly cautious, the result of too many years listening to Marcus's safety briefings and emergency procedures. The remainder of the afternoon passed uneventfully. Sarah finished her book, dozed again, and enjoyed the dinner service prepared by the flight attendants. The aircraft flew steadily westward, crossing time zones and leaving the North American continent far behind. As evening approached, though the sun wouldn't set for several more hours at their latitude, Sarah began to feel the familiar restlessness that came with long flights. She walked the aisles, did some stretches in the galley area, and chatted with other passengers. A businessman from Portland was traveling to Tokyo for a software conference. A retired couple from Vancouver was beginning a 3-week tour of Asia. A young woman from Seattle was moving to Japan to teach English. Each passenger had their own story, their own reason for crossing the Pacific, but they were all united by their temporary dependence on the skill and professionalism of the crew. Sarah had never fully appreciated this aspect of flying until she married Marcus. The implicit trust that passengers placed in people they would never meet, would never know, but whose expertise and dedication would determine whether they reached their destination safely. At 7:30 p.m. Seattle time, though the sun was still high in the northern sky, Sarah decided to check on Marcus again. The flight had been smooth for hours, but she wanted to see how he and Rodriguez were handling the long stint in the cockpit. The scene in the cockpit was subtly different from her earlier visit. Both pilots were at their stations, but Rodriguez appeared to be struggling with something. His breathing seemed labored, and he was gripping the control yoke more tightly than necessary for level flight. "Everything okay up here?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. Marcus looked up with obvious concern. "Alejandro's not feeling well. We're discussing whether we should divert to Anchorage or continue to Tokyo. It's nothing serious," Rodriguez insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just fatigue and maybe something I ate. We're only 4 hours from Tokyo now." Sarah studied the captain's face and saw something that alarmed her, a slight asymmetry in his expression, as if one side of his face wasn't responding quite normally. She'd seen that look before when her grandfather had his stroke, though Rodriguez's symptoms were much subtler. "Maybe you should let Marcus fly for a while," she suggested carefully. "You could rest in the bunk upstairs." "I'm the pilot in command," Rodriguez replied with more force than necessary. "I don't abandon my post because of a headache." Marcus caught Sarah's eye and nodded slightly. He'd noticed the same thing she had. "Alejandro, there's no shame in taking a break. That's why there are 2 of us up here." Before Rodriguez could respond, the aircraft's master warning alarm began to sound a urgent, electronic tone that filled the cockpit with its insistent demand for attention. Red lights illuminated on the overhead panel, and Rodriguez instinctively reached for the controls, but his hand moved sluggishly, uncoordinated, and Sarah watched in growing horror as the captain's condition deteriorated rapidly before her eyes. Rodriguez's speech became slurred as he tried to read the warning messages, and his attempts to manipulate the controls were increasingly ineffective. "Marcus," Sarah said urgently, "something's really wrong with him." Marcus was already reaching across the cockpit to take control of the aircraft, but Rodriguez fought him, confused and disoriented, but still trying to perform his duties as captain. The struggle between the 2 pilots sent conflicting commands to the aircraft's flight controls, and the Boeing 777 began to deviate from its assigned altitude and heading. That's when the real emergency began. The master warning alarm continued its urgent wail as Marcus struggled to wrest control of the aircraft from Rodriguez, whose condition was deteriorating with frightening speed. Sarah pressed herself against the back wall of the cockpit, her heart pounding as she watched her husband try to manage both a medical emergency and a mechanical crisis simultaneously. "Seattle Center, Pacific 447 requesting immediate medical assistance and priority handling," Marcus transmitted while attempting to stabilize their flight path. "We have a pilot experiencing what appears to be a medical emergency." Rodriguez was fighting the controls, his confused attempts to help only making the situation worse. His speech had become completely garbled, and the left side of his face was beginning to droop noticeably. "Alejandro, I need you to let go of the controls." Marcus said as calmly as possible while wrestling with the control yoke. "Just let me have it for a minute." But Rodriguez couldn't seem to process the instruction. His hands remained locked on his control yoke, sending conflicting inputs to the aircraft's flight management system. The Boeing 777 responded by oscillating between climb and descent modes, its sophisticated computers unable to reconcile the contradictory commands from the two pilot stations. Sarah realized she needed to help somehow, but she had no idea what to do. Her knowledge of aircraft systems came entirely from dinner conversations with Marcus, and those had focused more on routine procedures than emergency management. "Can I do something?" she asked, raising her voice over the warning alarms. "Call Janet," Marcus replied tersely, his full attention focused on the flight controls. "Tell her we need medical assistance up here immediately." Sarah rushed to the cockpit door and yanked it open, nearly colliding with Janet Mills, who was already hurrying forward in response to the alarms. "What's happening?" Janet demanded. "The captain's having some kind of medical emergency stroke, maybe. Marcus needs help getting him away from the controls." Janet pushed past Sarah into the cockpit, her training taking over despite the shocking scene before her. Rodriguez was slumped partially forward, his breathing ragged, while Marcus fought to maintain control of the aircraft with one hand and reach across to disengage Rodriguez's control inputs with the other. Pacific 447 Seattle Center, say nature. "Of your emergency," came the voice from air traffic control. "Seattle, Pacific 447. We have a pilot experiencing apparent stroke symptoms and aircraft control issues. Requesting immediate clearance to nearest suitable airport," Marcus replied, his voice strained with effort. "Pacific 447, roger. Anchorage International is your closest option, bearing 045, distance 220 miles. Turn right. Heading 045, descend and maintain flight level 300. Marcus acknowledged the clearance while Janet worked to move Rodriguez away from his control station. The captain was conscious but severely impaired, unable to assist. In his own movement but still trying weakly to reach for the controls. "Is there a doctor on board?" Janet called over the intercom as she struggled with Rodriguez's dead weight. Sarah helped Janet maneuver Rodriguez into the jump seat behind the cockpit, where he slumped forward with his chin on his chest, breathing heavily but no longer interfering with the aircraft's controls. The immediate crisis seemed to be passing. Marcus had regained full control of the aircraft and was turning toward Anchorage as directed. But then the second wave of the emergency began. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a cardiologist from Portland, appeared in the cockpit doorway within minutes of Janet's announcement. She took one look at Rodriguez and immediately began checking his vital signs, while Sarah and Janet tried to give her room to work in the cramped space. "Definitely stroke symptoms," Dr. Warren confirmed grimly. "He needs immediate medical attention. But there's nothing I can do for him at altitude." "How long to the nearest airport?" 35 minutes to Anchorage," Marcus replied, his hand steady on the controls as he monitored their descent. "We're cleared for an emergency approach." Dr. Warren continued her examination of Rodriguez while Sarah watched the altimeter unwind through 25,000 feet. The aircraft felt stable now, and Marcus seemed to have everything under control. She began to relax slightly, thinking the worst of the crisis was over. That's when Marcus started showing the same symptoms. It began subtly, a slight hesitation in his radio communications, a momentary fumbling with the frequency selection knob. Sarah noticed it first because she knew her husband's mannerisms so well, but within minutes it became obvious to everyone in the cockpit that something was seriously wrong with the first officer as well. "Marcus?" Sarah said carefully, watching, as he blinked repeatedly and shook his head as if trying to clear his vision. "I'm okay," he replied, but his words were slightly slurred. "Just tired, been a long day." Dr. Warren looked up sharply from Rodriguez. "What did you have for dinner, both of you?" "Crew meal," Marcus answered, his speech becoming more labored. Chicken ... something, with rice. When did you eat it? Maybe. Hour ago? Little more? Dr. Warren's expression turned grim. I think we might be looking at food poisoning, not stroke. Something that affects the nervous system, possibly botulism or another neurotoxin. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. If both pilots had been poisoned by contaminated food, they were facing a disaster far worse than a single medical emergency. She looked at Marcus, who was still flying the aircraft but clearly struggling with increasing symptoms. How long before? She started to ask, but the question died in her throat as she watched Marcus's hands begin to tremble on the controls. Depends on the toxin and the dose, Dr. Warren replied grimly. Could be minutes or hours. But if it's what I think it is, both pilots are going to be incapacitated soon. The implications hit everyone in the cockpit simultaneously. Seattle Center was expecting them to land at Anchorage in 30 minutes, but if Marcus became unable to fly the aircraft, they would have a Boeing 777 with 247 people aboard, and no one qualified to land it. Pacific 447, Anchorage approach, turn left heading 020. Descend and maintain 10,000 for vectors to runway 07 right. Marcus acknowledged the transmission, but Sarah could hear the increasing difficulty in his speech. His coordination was deteriorating rapidly, the same progression she'd witnessed in Rodriguez, just delayed by whatever difference in their exposure to the contaminated food. Is there another pilot on board? Dr. Warren asked Janet. Off duty. Crew? Anyone with flight experience? Janet was already shaking her head. I checked the passenger manifest. No listed crew members deadheading. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Marcus might have 10 or 15 minutes of useful consciousness left, maybe less. Even if there were other pilots among the passengers, which seemed unlikely, they would need time to familiarize themselves with the Boeing 777 systems. Time they didn't have. Marcus, she said urgently, what can I do? How can I help? Her husband looked at her with eyes that were increasingly unfocused. Sarah ... I don't know if I can land this thing. My hands ... can't feel the controls properly. The aircraft lurched slightly as Marcus's grip on the yoke wavered. He corrected immediately, but the movement sent a chill through everyone in the cockpit. If he lost the ability to control the aircraft while they were still at altitude, they would face an immediate crisis. Pacific 447, Anchorage approach. You appear to be deviating from your assigned heading. Please confirm your status. Sarah looked at the instruments, an incomprehensible array of dials, screens, and switches that represented their lifeline. Marcus was struggling to reach the radio, his movements increasingly uncoordinated. That's when she realized there might be only one option left. She was going to have to learn to fly a Boeing 777 in the next 20 minutes, or everyone aboard was going to die. Marcus, she said with forced calm, I need you to teach me everything I need to know to land this airplane. Right now. Marcus stared at Sarah with a mixture of confusion and growing panic as his condition continued to deteriorate. The Boeing 777 was flying level at 10,000 feet, but maintaining that stability required constant small adjustments that were becoming increasingly difficult for him to make. Sarah, you can't. You don't understand how complex ... He began, then stopped as another wave of neurological symptoms swept over him. His head drooped forward momentarily before he forced it back up. Then teach me the basics, Sarah insisted. What do I absolutely need to know to keep us alive? Doctor. Warren had moved to monitor both pilots now, checking Rodriguez's pulse while keeping an eye on Marcus's declining condition. We've got maybe 10 minutes before he's completely incapacitated, she announced grimly. If you're going to do this, it has to be now. Janet had returned to the cabin to manage the passenger situation, but Sarah could hear the growing anxiety in the main compartment as travelers began to realize something was seriously wrong. The aircraft's deviations from smooth flight hadn't gone unnoticed, and several passengers had noticed the medical emergency in first class. "Okay," Marcus said, struggling to focus on the instruments. "First thing, this yoke controls the aircraft attitude. Push forward, we go down. Pull back, we go up. Turn left or right like a steering wheel." Sarah positioned herself in the jump seat directly behind Marcus, where she could see over his shoulder to the instrument panel. The array of displays was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus on what Marcus was pointing out. "Those numbers there," he continued, indicating a digital display in the center of the panel. "That's our altitude. Right now it says 10,000. Below that is our airspeed. We want to stay around 250 knots for approach." 250 knots, Sarah repeated. "How fast is that in miles per hour?" About ... About 290. But don't think in miles per hour. Just watch those numbers." The radio crackled again. "Pacific 447, Anchorage approach. We show you level at 10,000. Are you ready to continue your approach?" Marcus reached for the microphone, but his hand missed it on the first attempt. Sarah leaned forward and handed it to him, watching as he struggled to key the transmit button. "Anchorage ... Pacific 447 ... We have a developing situation. Both pilots experiencing severe food poisoning. First officer's wife is going to attempt to land the aircraft under instruction." The silence that followed lasted several seconds, an eternity in aviation communications. "Pacific 447, say again? Did you say passenger will attempt landing?" "Affirmative, Anchorage. Mrs. Chen has been receiving basic instruction. She's our only option." Sarah could imagine the controlled panic that announcement had just created in the Anchorage approach control facility. They were facing a scenario that existed more in aviation nightmares than real-world emergency procedures. "Pacific 447, roger. Stand by for special handling. We're declaring an emergency on your behalf and clearing all traffic from your area." Marcus turned to Sarah with tremendous effort. "Listen carefully. When I can't do this anymore, you're going to slide into my seat. The most important thing is to keep the aircraft stable. Small movements on the yoke. Don't overcorrect." "What about landing? How do I get us on the ground?" "The autopilot will help with most of it, but you'll need to understand the basics." Marcus's words were becoming increasingly slurred. "See that button marked APP? That engages the approach mode. The aircraft will follow the instrument landing system down to the runway." Sarah tried to process this information while watching Marcus struggle with the controls. His hands were shaking noticeably now, and his head kept dropping forward as he fought to stay conscious. "But what if the autopilot doesn't work? What if I have to land manually? Then ... Marcus paused, blinking hard. "Then we're in serious trouble. Landing a 777 manually requires thousands of hours of training." Dr. Warren checked Marcus's pulse and pupil response. "He's fading fast. Maybe 5 more minutes of useful consciousness." "Pacific 447, Anchorage approach. We have Captain Steve Hendricks from Alaska Airlines here with us. He's going to talk you through this step by step. Are you ready to copy instructions?" Sarah grabbed the microphone as Marcus's hand fell away from it. "This is Sarah Chen aboard Pacific 447. I'm ready to learn whatever you can teach me. Mrs. Chen, this is Captain Hendricks. I've been flying 777s for 12 years, and I'm going to get you safely on the ground. First question, can you see the autopilot panel? It's in the center of the instrument panel, between the two pilots." Sarah leaned forward to study the array of switches and buttons Marcus had pointed out earlier. "I can see it. There are lots of buttons and displays." "Good. Right now, what does the altitude window show?" "It should be a digital display with numbers." 10,000, Sarah replied. "Perfect. And the speed window should show something around 250? Sarah found the airspeed display. 2-40-8. Excellent. The autopilot is maintaining your altitude and speed right now, which is exactly what we want. In a few minutes, we're going to start your descent toward the airport. Marcus stirred in his seat, trying to speak. Sarah leaned close to hear him. Tell him about the fuel, Marcus whispered. We're getting low, long flight from Seattle. Sarah relayed this information to Captain Hendricks, who acknowledged the additional urgency. They had been flying for over 10 hours, and fuel consumption was becoming a critical factor in their emergency planning. Mrs. Chen, we're going to begin your approach in about 2 minutes. I need you to start transitioning to the pilot's seat now, while your husband can still help guide you. The thought of actually taking control of the aircraft terrified Sarah, but she knew there was no alternative. Marcus was barely conscious, his chin dropping toward his chest as the neurological toxin continued to affect his nervous system. Okay, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm moving to the pilot's seat. As Sarah slid into the left seat, the captain's position, she was struck by how different everything looked from this perspective. The instrument seemed more complex, the responsibilities more overwhelming. Her feet barely reached the rudder. Pedals and the control yoke felt heavy and unresponsive in her hands. I can feel the aircraft moving when I touch the controls, she reported to Captain Hendricks. That's normal. The 777 is very responsive. Remember what your husband told you, small movements only. Right now, just rest your hands on the yoke and get a feel for it. Marcus managed to lift his head one more time. Sarah ... You can do this. Trust the instruments. Trust Hendricks. Small corrections. Those were the last coherent words her husband spoke. His eyes closed, and his breathing became shallow and irregular as the toxin completed its work on his nervous system. Dr. Warren immediately moved to check his vital signs. He's stable, but completely unconscious, same as the captain. Sarah was now alone in the pilot's seat of a Boeing 777, responsible for the lives of 247 people, with nothing but radio instructions from a pilot she'd never met and fragments of aviation knowledge gleaned from years of marriage to a professional aviator. Pacific 447, Anchorage approach. We're beginning your vectors for the approach. Turn left heading 350 and begin descent to 8,000 feet. Sarah stared at the controls, her hands trembling as she prepared to make the first command inputs that would begin their approach to what she desperately hoped would be a survivable landing. Outside the cockpit windows, the lights of Anchorage were beginning to appear in the distance, a welcome sight that represented safety, medical attention for Marcus and Rodriguez, and the end of the most terrifying experience of her life, if she could figure out how to get them there alive. Sarah's hands hovered over the autopilot panel as Captain Hendricks' calm voice guided her through the complexities of modern aviation. The Boeing 777 felt like a living thing beneath her, responding to every slight pressure on the controls with movements that translated into life or death consequences for everyone aboard. Mrs. Chen, I need you to find the heading select knob, Hendricks instructed. It should be a knob you can turn, located on the autopilot panel. Sarah scanned the bewildering array of controls until she located what appeared to be the right control. I think I found it. It has numbers around it like a compass. Exactly right. Now turn it slowly to the left until it reads 350. The aircraft will begin turning automatically. As Sarah rotated the knob, she felt the Boeing 777 bank gently to the left. Through the windscreen, she could see the lights of Anchorage slowly sliding across their field of view as the aircraft responded to her input. It's working, she reported, surprised by the responsiveness of the sophisticated flight management system. Good job. Now we need to begin your descent. Find the Altitude select window. It should show 10,000 right now. Sarah located the digital display Hendricks had described. I see it. Turn the altitude select knob to change it to 8,000. Then press the altitude select button to engage the descent. This proved more challenging. Sarah had to study the controls carefully to distinguish between the various knobs and buttons, all of which looked similar in the green glow of the instrument panel. When she finally made the correct selection, the aircraft's nose dropped slightly as it began a controlled descent toward their new altitude. Descent rate looks good from here, Hendricks confirmed. You're doing exactly what you need to do. But Sarah could hear the tension underlying his professional calm. She knew that talking someone through an approach and landing was unprecedented in his experience, and the margin for error was essentially zero. Behind her, Dr. Warren continued to monitor Marcus and Rodriguez. Both men were breathing steadily but showed no signs of consciousness. Janet Mills had returned to the cockpit with updates from the cabin. Passengers know something's wrong, but they're staying calm for now, Janet reported. I told them we're dealing with a medical emergency and diverting to Anchorage. A few are asking questions, but most seem to accept that explanation. Sarah was grateful for Janet's experience in managing passenger anxiety. The last thing they needed was panic in the cabin while she was trying to learn the fundamentals of flying the commercial airliner. How much time do we have before we need to land? Sarah asked Hendricks over the radio. About 15 minutes to touchdown, assuming everything goes smoothly. We're vectoring you for a straight-in approach to runway 07, right? That's Anchorage's longest runway at over 10,000 feet. Plenty of room for error. The mention of error sent a chill through Sarah's spine. She was acutely aware that she was operating far beyond her capabilities, relying entirely on the autopilot systems and remote guidance from someone who couldn't see what she was seeing or feel what she was feeling. Pacific 447, Anchorage Tower, is standing by with emergency equipment, came a new voice over the radio. Fire and rescue teams are positioned along the runway, and medical personnel are standing by for your passengers with food poisoning symptoms. Food poisoning. Sarah realized that other passengers might have eaten the same contaminated crew meal that had incapacitated Marcus and Rodriguez. She glanced back at Janet with alarm. Did any passengers eat from the crew meal service? Janet's expression grew concerned. Not the crew meal specifically, but we served chicken entrees to about 60 passengers in coach. If it's the same supplier... The implications were staggering. If other passengers began showing neurological symptoms during the approach and landing, they could have chaos in the cabin at the worst possible moment. Mrs. Chen, Hendricks' voice drew her attention back to the immediate crisis. I need you to find the approach mode button. It should be labeled APP on the autopilot panel. Sarah located the button and pressed it, watching as new symbols appeared on the flight management display. The aircraft's behavior changed subtly. It began following a more precise course toward the airport, guided by radio beacons on the ground. The localizer is alive, Hendricks confirmed. You're tracking perfectly toward the runway centerline. In about 5 minutes, you'll intercept the glide slope. That's the vertical guidance that will take you down to the runway. What do I need to do when that happens? Nothing. The autopilot will capture the glide slope automatically and begin your final descent. Your job is to monitor the airspeed and be ready to take control if something goes wrong. The word wrong hung in the air, like a threat. Sarah tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong during an approach and landing mechanical failures. Wind shear, her own inexperience leading to a critical mistake. Pacific 447, you're cleared for the ILS approach runway 07. Right. Contact tower on frequency 118.1 when you have the runway in sight. Sarah acknowledged the clearance, then switched radio frequencies as Hendricks instructed. The new controller Anchorage Tower sounded even more tense than the approach controller had been. Pacific 447, Anchorage Tower. We have you on radar 5 miles from the runway. Winds are light and variable. Visibility 10 miles. Emergency equipment is standing by. Through the windscreen, Sarah could see the approach lights of runway 07 right stretching into the distance like a string of pearls. The sight was both reassuring and terrifying. Their destination was clearly visible, but she still had to figure out how to get the massive aircraft safely onto that narrow strip of concrete. "I can see the runway," she reported to both tower and Captain Hendricks. "Outstanding," Hendricks replied. "The autopilot should capture the glide slope any moment now. You'll see the flight path vector change on your display, and the aircraft will begin a steadier descent." As if on cue, the Boeing 777's nose dropped slightly as it intercepted the electronic glide slope that would guide them down to the runway. Sarah watched the altitude decrease steadily. 6,000 feet, 5,500, 5,000. "Speed looks good. Descent rate is perfect," Hendricks encouraged. "You're flying a textbook approach." But Sarah knew the most challenging part was still ahead. The autopilot could guide them down to about 200 feet above the runway, but the actual landing would require manual control. She would have to disconnect the autopilot and fly the aircraft by hand for the final moments, something she had never done and that professional pilots spent years learning to master. "Captain Hendricks," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "what exactly do I need to do for the landing? When do I take manual control?" "We'll keep the autopilot engaged as long as possible," he replied. "But you'll need to disconnect it at about 200 feet and manually control the touchdown. I'm going to talk you through every step." Dr. Warren's voice cut through the cockpit. "I've got another passenger showing symptoms." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who?" "Businessman in first class, seat 2A. Same progression, slurred speech, difficulty coordinating movements. He definitely ate the chicken entree." Janet immediately headed back to the cabin to assess the situation. The possibility of passenger panic during the approach was becoming a very real threat. "How many passengers had the chicken?" Sarah called after her. "I'll check the meal count and get back to you," Janet replied, her voice tight with anxiety. The aircraft continued its steady descent. 3,000 feet, 2,500, 2,000. Sarah could see individual details on the ground now, the terminal buildings, the fire trucks positioned along the runway, the approach lights growing larger in the windscreen. "Pacific 447, you're looking good from the tower. Continue your approach." At 1,000 feet above ground level, Captain Hendricks began his final instructions. "Mrs. Chen, in about 30 seconds, I'm going to have you disconnect the autopilot. The aircraft will want to continue flying straight and level, so you'll need to make small adjustments to keep it descending toward the runway." Sarah's hands were sweating as she gripped the control yoke. Everything she had learned about flying in the past 20 minutes was about to be tested in the most critical phase of flight. 1,500 feet, she reported, watching the altimeter unwind. "Perfect. At 1,000 feet, I want you to find the autopilot disconnect button. It should be a red button on the control yoke." Sarah located the button, her thumb hovering over it as they descended through 1,200 feet. 1,000 feet, she announced. "Disconnect the autopilot now and take control of the aircraft." Sarah pressed the button and immediately felt the Boeing 777 become her responsibility. The control yoke came alive in her hands, and she could feel every slight change in the aircraft's attitude and energy state. "I've got it," she reported, though she wasn't sure she really did. "Good. Now keep the nose pointed at the runway and maintain your descent rate. Small corrections only the aircraft wants to fly." But as they descended through 800 feet, Sarah realized she was facing a new crisis. Janet's voice came over the Intercom from the cabin. We have multiple passengers showing symptoms. At least 6 people in coach are experiencing coordination problems. The contaminated food had affected more people than just the flight crew, and the symptoms were manifesting just as Sarah was attempting the most critical phase of the flight. If passengers began to panic or become disoriented during the landing, the resulting chaos could doom everyone aboard. Focus on the runway, Hendricks instructed, sensing her attention wavering. The cabin crew will handle the passengers. Your job is to get this aircraft on the ground safely. Sarah forced herself to concentrate on the approaching runway, now clearly visible ahead of them. The fire trucks lined both sides of the runway, their red lights flashing in the gathering dusk. She was committed now. There was no going around. No second chance. At 500 feet above the ground, with the runway rushing up to meet them, Sarah Chen prepared to attempt something that even experienced pilots found challenging: landing a Boeing 777 with 247 lives depending on her success. The Boeing 777 descended through 500 feet with Sarah fighting to maintain control as the aircraft seemed to develop a mind of its own. Without the autopilot's stabilizing influence, every slight air current and thermal updraft translated into movements that required immediate correction. 400 feet, Sarah called out, her voice tight with concentration. The runway's getting really big really fast. That's normal, Captain Hendricks assured her over the radio. The key is to not let the nose drop too much. Keep pulling back gently on the yoke to maintain your descent angle. Through the windscreen, Sarah could see the runway threshold approaching rapidly. The white landing lights stretched ahead of them like a pathway to safety, but the speed of their approach was overwhelming. Everything was happening faster than she had anticipated. 300 feet. Airspeed is U. 230 knots. A little fast but manageable, Hendricks replied. At 200 feet, I want you to start reducing power. Pull the throttles back slowly. They're the black levers between you and the first officer's seat. Sarah could see the throttle levers Hendricks had described, but reaching for them meant taking one hand off the control yoke. The aircraft immediately began to drift to the right as she reduced her grip. I'm drifting off centerline, she reported, struggling to correct their path while managing the throttles. Use your feet on the rudder pedals to stay aligned with the runway. Small inputs, just gentle pressure. The coordination required was beyond anything Sarah had imagined. She needed to simultaneously manage the aircraft's vertical descent, horizontal alignment, speed control, and directional guidance tasks that professional pilots practiced for thousands of hours before attempting in a real aircraft. 200 feet, she announced, pulling the throttles back as instructed. The engine noise decreased noticeably, and the aircraft's descent rate increased. Good, now start to level off. Pull back gently on the yoke to reduce your descent rate. Sarah pulled back on the controls, but the aircraft's response felt sluggish and imprecise. They were still descending rapidly, and the runway was rushing up to meet them at an alarming rate. Behind her, the situation in the cabin was deteriorating rapidly. Janet's voice crackled over the intercom. We now have 12 passengers showing neurological symptoms. Some are having difficulty staying in their seats. Dr. Warren had left the cockpit to help manage the medical crisis in the passenger compartment, leaving Sarah effectively alone with 2 unconscious pilots and radio guidance from Captain Hendricks. 150 feet, Sarah called out, fighting to maintain control as the aircraft bounced in the turbulent air near the ground. You're doing great, Hendricks encouraged. At 50 feet, I want you to start the flare. Pull back steadily on the yoke to raise the nose and reduce your descent rate. The concept of flaring for landing was something Marcus had explained to her years ago, but understanding it intellectually and executing it manually were completely different challenges. Sarah had to judge the exact moment to begin raising the nose balancing the need to slow their descent against the risk of stalling the aircraft. 100 feet, 70-5. 50 feet, starting the flare now. Sarah pulled back on the control yoke, watching the nose rise as the runway filled her entire field of view. The aircraft seemed to float for a moment, suspended between flight and landing, as she tried to judge the perfect moment for touchdown. Hold it off, hold it off, Hendricks coached. Let the aircraft settle onto the runway. But the timing was all wrong. Sarah had started the flare too early and at too high an airspeed. The Boeing 777 ballooned back up into the air, climbing to nearly 100 feet above the runway as the excess speed translated into unwanted lift. I messed up, Sarah called out in panic. We're climbing again. No problem, Hendricks replied, though she could hear the tension in his voice. Push the nose down gently and let the aircraft settle back down. You've got plenty of runway left. Sarah pushed forward on the control yoke, but her correction was too aggressive. The aircraft dove toward the runway at a steep angle, the ground rushing up at them with frightening speed. Pull up, pull up, Hendricks shouted over the radio. Sarah hauled back on the controls, the aircraft's nose rising, just as the main landing gear struck the runway with tremendous force. The impact sent a shudder through the entire aircraft, followed by the screech of tires and the roar of reverse thrust as the engines automatically activated to help slow their roll. We're down, Sarah screamed, her hands shaking as she fought to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the runway centerline. Outstanding job, Hendricks replied. Now you need to stop the aircraft. The brakes are the top of the rudder pedals. Press down with your toes. Sarah pressed on the brake pedals, feeling the aircraft slow dramatically as the anti-skid system modulated the brake pressure. Through the windscreen, she could see the emergency vehicles racing alongside them, ready to respond if anything went wrong during the rollout. Turn off at the first taxiway you see, Hendricks instructed. Use the rudder pedals to steer. The aircraft will follow your inputs. Sarah managed to guide the Boeing 777 off the active runway and onto a parallel taxiway, where she finally brought the massive aircraft to a complete stop. The sudden silence in the cockpit, broken only by the sound of cooling engines and her own ragged breathing, felt surreal after the intensity of the past 30 minutes. Pacific 447, emergency equipment is surrounding your aircraft, came the voice of Anchorage Tower. Medical personnel are standing by to board and assist your passengers and crew. Through the side windows, Sarah could see firefighters and paramedics approaching the aircraft. The nightmare was finally over. They were on the ground alive, and help was on the way. But even as relief flooded through her, Sarah realized that the most challenging part of her ordeal might still be ahead. Marcus and Rodriguez needed immediate medical attention, and at least a dozen passengers were showing signs of serious food poisoning. The investigation into what had happened would be complex and far-reaching. Janet appeared in the cockpit doorway, her professional composure finally cracking as the magnitude of what Sarah had accomplished sank in. "You did it," Janet said simply. "You actually did it." Sarah looked back at her unconscious husband, then at the control yoke still gripped in her white-knuckled hands. She had landed a Boeing 777 with no flight training, no experience, and nothing but radio guidance from a pilot. She had never met Dot as the first paramedics boarded the aircraft and began assessing Marcus and Rodriguez. Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that they were all going to survive this crisis. But she also knew that her life and her relationship with aviation would never be the same. The emergency was over, but the investigation was just beginning. The Anchorage Airport terminal had been transformed into a makeshift medical triage center within an hour of Pacific 447's emergency landing. Sarah sat in a sterile waiting room, still wearing her burgundy dress now wrinkled and stained with sweat, as she watched a Steady stream of medical personnel attend to the passengers and crew who had been affected by the contaminated food. Marcus lay unconscious in the emergency department of Alaska Regional Hospital, connected to monitors and 4 lines as doctors worked to counteract the effects of what they had confirmed was botulinum toxin, deadly neurotoxin that had somehow contaminated the crew meal service. Captain Rodriguez was in the bed next to him, equally unresponsive, but with stable vital signs. Dr. Warren, who had initially helped diagnose the crisis aboard the aircraft, now found herself coordinating the medical response on the ground. She approached Sarah with an update on the affected passengers. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 14 passengers in total showed symptoms, Dr. Warren reported. All of them had the chicken entree in coach class. The good news is that most of them received a much smaller dose than your husband and Captain Rodriguez. They should recover fully within 24 to 48 hours. And Marcus? Rodriguez? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. It's harder to predict. They got a concentrated dose through the crew meal. The neurological effects could persist for days or even weeks. But they're both stable, and the toxin doesn't typically cause permanent damage if treated promptly. Sarah nodded, trying to process the medical information while her mind still reeled from the events of the flight. She had landed a commercial airline or something. That should have been impossible for someone with her background, but the relief of survival was tempered by uncertainty about Marcus's recovery. Agent Jennifer Martinez from the National Transportation Safety Board had arrived from Seattle within hours of the emergency landing. She was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s with 20 years of experience investigating aviation incidents, though she had never encountered anything quite like Pacific 447. Mrs. Chen, Agent Martinez said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. I know this has been a traumatic experience, but I need to ask you some questions while the details are still fresh in your memory. Of course. I'll tell you everything I can remember. Let's start with the crew meal service. Do you know what time Captain Rodriguez and your husband ate their dinner? Sarah tried to reconstruct the timeline. It was about an hour before Rodriguez started showing symptoms, maybe 7:30 Seattle time. They both had the chicken dish. I remember Marcus mentioning it when Dr. Warren asked, did you observe anyone else handling the crew meals? Ground service personnel, catering staff, other crew members? No, I was in the passenger cabin most of the flight. Janet Mills would know more about the meal service procedures. Agent Martinez made notes on her tablet. The preliminary investigation suggests the contamination was localized to a specific batch of crew meals. The passenger meals came from a different catering facility, which is why only the passengers who specifically requested crew meals were affected. So this was accidental? Not intentional? We're still investigating all possibilities, but botulinum toxin contamination typically results from improper food preparation or storage. It's rare, but not unheard of in commercial catering operations. The thought that the crisis had been caused by something as mundane as food safety protocols was both reassuring and disturbing. Sarah had been imagining deliberate sabotage or terrorism, but the reality might be even more frightening, a random accident that had nearly killed 247 people. I need to ask you about the landing, Agent Martinez continued. Can you walk me through your decision-making process? What made you think you could successfully land the aircraft? Sarah considered the question carefully. I didn't think I could land it, honestly. I knew I had to try because there wasn't anyone else. Marcus and Rodriguez were unconscious, and no one else on board had flight experience. Had you ever flown any type of aircraft before, even small planes? No, never. The only aviation knowledge I had came from being married to Marcus for 10 years. I'd heard him talk about procedures and systems, but I'd never touched the controls of any aircraft. Agent Martinez's expression suggested she was having difficulty believing what she was hearing. So you learned to fly a Boeing 777 entirely through radio instruction from Captain Hendricks? Captain Hendricks was incredible. He guided me through every step, from basic aircraft control to the approach and landing procedures. Without him, we would have crashed. The preliminary flight data recorder analysis shows you performed a successful instrument approach and landing with only minor deviations from standard parameters. That's remarkable for someone with no flight training. Sarah wasn't sure whether to feel proud or terrified by this assessment. I was mostly just trying not to kill everyone. I don't remember making any conscious decisions about technique or procedures. Fear and adrenaline can sometimes enhance performance in crisis situations, Agent Martinez observed. But what you accomplished was still extraordinary by any measure. Janet Mills joined them in the waiting area, looking exhausted after hours of coordinating with investigators and airline management. She had been debriefed extensively about the cabin management during the emergency and the timeline of passenger symptoms. "How are you holding up?" Janet asked Sarah, settling into a nearby chair. "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing everyone," Sarah replied. "If Marcus had become incapacitated 10 minutes earlier, or if the weather hadn't been perfect, or if Captain Hendricks hadn't been available to talk me through the landing." "But none of those things happened," Janet pointed out. "You saved 247 lives tonight. That's what matters." Agent Martinez looked up from her notes. "Janet, I wanted to ask you about crew training for this type of scenario. Do flight attendants receive any instruction on basic aircraft operation?" "We learn the location of emergency equipment and basic procedures for communicating with air traffic control," Janet replied. "But actual flight training? No, we're specifically instructed never to attempt to operate aircraft controls unless it's a life or death situation." "Which this definitely was," Sarah added. "The airline industry will be studying this incident for years," Agent Martinez said. "It raises questions about crew training, emergency procedures, and passenger safety protocols that we've never had to consider before." Captain Steve Hendricks arrived at the hospital around midnight, having flown commercially from Anchorage to Seattle as soon as his shift ended. Sarah recognized his voice immediately from their radio conversations, though. Seeing him in person was surreal after the intensity of their shared experience. "Mrs. Chen," Hendricks said, extending his hand. "I wanted to meet you in person and tell you how impressed I was with your performance tonight." "I couldn't have done it without you," Sarah replied. "You saved all of our lives." "No, you did that. I just provided guidance. The actual flying, the decision-making, the aircraft control, the landing, that was all you." Hendricks was a compact man in his 50s with graying hair and the confident bearing of a veteran airline pilot. He had flown for Alaska Airlines for over 20 years and had been working as an approach controller part-time to supplement his income. "I've been flying for 30 years, Hendricks continued, "and I've never encountered anything like what happened tonight. The fact that you were able to land that aircraft safely with no training is going to change how we think about emergency procedures." Dr. Warren joined their group with an update on Marcus's condition. "He's starting to show some signs of neurological improvement. The paralysis is beginning to recede, starting with his fingers and facial muscles. It's a good sign." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. When will he be fully recovered? Difficult to say. Botulinum toxin affects everyone differently, and the dose he received was quite concentrated. But I estimate he'll be conscious and communicating within 24 hours, with full recovery taking perhaps a week. "What about his flying career?" Sarah asked. "Will this affect his medical certification?" "That's a question for the FAA medical examiners," Dr. Warren replied. "But assuming he makes a complete recovery with no lasting effects, there's no reason he couldn't return to flying." As the immediate medical crisis stabilized, Sarah began to think about the broader implications of what had happened. The media. Attention would be intense. A story about an untrained passenger landing a commercial airliner would capture international headlines. The aviation industry would scrutinize every aspect of the incident, from the food safety protocols to the emergency response procedures. But more personally, Sarah realized that her relationship with flying and with Marcus's career had been fundamentally changed. She had experienced aviation from the perspective of someone responsible for the aircraft and its passengers, understanding in a visceral way the tremendous skill and responsibility that commercial pilots carried every day. "I need to ask you something," she said to Captain Hendricks. "Do you think I should learn to fly? I mean, take actual flight lessons?" Hendricks smiled. "After what you did tonight, I think you could learn to fly anything you wanted. But whether you should is entirely up to you." As dawn broke over Anchorage, Sarah sat beside Marcus's hospital bed, watching his vital signs stabilize and his color gradually return to normal. The crisis was over, but she knew the repercussions would continue. For months or even years. The investigation would be thorough and public. The media attention would be overwhelming, and the aviation industry would implement new procedures based on what had happened aboard Pacific 447. But for now, she was content to hold her husband's hand and be grateful that they were both alive to face whatever came next. 3 days after the emergency landing, Sarah's life had been turned completely upside down. Their hotel room at the Anchorage Marriott had become an impromptu command center, with Marcus's airline benefits coordinator, a public relations specialist, and Agent Martinez from the NTS be taking turns briefing them on the developing investigation. And media response. The story had exploded across international news outlets within hours of the landing. "Untrained woman lands Boeing 777 after pilots poisoned," ran on CNN. The BBC led with "Heroic wife saves 247 lives in miraculous landing." Japanese media, given that the flight had been bound for Tokyo, were particularly fascinated by the story. Marcus was conscious now and recovering steadily, though he still experienced periodic weakness and coordination problems. He sat propped up in the hotel bed, laptop open, scrolling through news coverage with a mixture of pride and concern. "Listen to this one," he said, reading from an aviation blog. "Sarah Chen's successful landing of Pacific Airways Flight 447 raises serious questions about pilot training requirements and emergency procedures. If an untrained passenger can safely land a modern airliner, perhaps we're overestimating the complexity of commercial aviation," Sarah groaned. "That completely misses the point. I got incredibly lucky, and I had perfect conditions and amazing guidance from Captain Hendricks. This wasn't some routine procedure anyone could learn in 30 minutes. "The media doesn't understand aviation," replied Karen Walsh, the Pacific Airways public relations coordinator. "They're looking for simple narratives, hero stories, conspiracy theories, or systemic failures. The actual complexity of what happened doesn't fit their format." Sarah's phone buzzed with another interview request. In the past 72 hours, she had been contacted by Good Morning America, 60 Minutes, CNN, BBC World Service, and dozens of other media outlets. Each wanted her first-person account of the emergency, preferably with dramatic details and emotional revelations. "I don't want to do any more interviews," Sarah announced. "The story keeps getting more sensationalized with each retelling." "Unfortunately, that might not be entirely your choice," Karen replied diplomatically. "This story has implications for the entire aviation industry. The FAA, the pilots' union, the aircraft manufacturer, and the airline all have interests in how it's portrayed." Agent Martinez knocked on the hotel room door and entered with an update on the investigation. "We've identified the source of the contamination," she announced. "It was a catering facility in Seattle that supplies crew meals for Pacific Airways. And 2 other carriers. Deliberate or accidental? Marcus asked. Accidental, but criminally negligent. The facility had been operating with expired safety certifications and inadequate refrigeration systems. The botulinum toxin developed in prepared chicken dishes that were held at unsafe temperatures for several hours before being loaded onto your aircraft. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that the poisoning hadn't been an act of terrorism, but anger that such basic safety protocols had been ignored. What happens to the catering company? She asked. Federal criminal charges are likely, along with massive civil liability. They'll probably be out of business within weeks. And Pacific Airways? The airline is cooperating fully with the investigation. Their procedures for vetting catering contractors will be scrutinized, but there's no evidence they knew about the safety violations. Marcus closed his laptop and looked at Agent Martinez. What about the lessons learned? Are you recommending changes to emergency procedures? That's still being determined. Your wife's successful landing was so unprecedented that it's difficult to develop standard procedures around it. We can't exactly train passengers to land airliners. But we could train flight attendants better, Sarah suggested. Janet Mills was incredible during the crisis, but she had no backup plan if I hadn't been able to figure out the controls. That's one possibility under consideration. Enhanced crew training, better communication protocols with ground-based pilots, maybe even simplified backup flight controls for extreme emergencies. Sarah's phone rang again. This time it was her parents calling from Portland, where they had been besieged by reporters seeking background information about their daughter's heroic feat. Honey, we're so proud of you, her mother said when Sarah answered. But these reporters won't leave us alone. They want to know about your childhood, your education, your relationship with Marcus, everything. Just tell them no comment and refer them to the airline's public relations department, Sarah advised, though she knew her parents weren't equipped to handle the media attention any better than she was. They're making it sound like you were some kind of aviation expert, her father added. One reporter asked if you had been secretly taking flying lessons. The misconceptions and embellishments were multiplying with each news cycle. Sarah had heard herself described as everything from a former air traffic controller to an aviation enthusiast who spent years preparing for emergencies. The truth that she was simply a museum curator who happened to be married to a pilot seemed too mundane for the media narrative. Dr. Warren appeared at their hotel room door in the early afternoon, carrying Marcus's latest medical test results. The neurologist had been monitoring his recovery closely, and the news was encouraging. Motor function is returning to normal ranges, she reported. Reflexes are good. Coordination is improving steadily. I think you'll be cleared to return to Seattle tomorrow or the day after. What about flying? Marcus asked. When can I return to work? That's a decision for the FAA medical examiners, but I see no reason why you shouldn't make a complete recovery. The toxin doesn't cause permanent neurological damage in cases like yours. Sarah felt tremendous relief at this news. Marcus's identity was so closely tied to his career as a pilot that losing his medical certification would have been devastating, regardless of the circumstances. There is one thing, Dr. Warren continued. The media attention around this case might actually benefit aviation medicine research. Botulinum poisoning in commercial aviation is extremely rare, and your case provides valuable data about symptom progression and recovery. So we're guinea pigs now? Marcus asked with a wry smile. Volunteer research subjects, Dr. Warren corrected. And your wife's actions have raised interesting questions about stress response and learning under extreme pressure. Psychologists are very interested in studying how she was able to acquire complex motor skills so rapidly. The psychological aspects of the crisis were something Sarah hadn't fully considered. She had operated in a state of heightened awareness and focus that felt almost superhuman in retrospect. The complex procedures that seemed impossible before the emergency had become manageable, even intuitive, when lives depended on her success. Captain Hendricks called in the late afternoon with news that the FAA was planning to formally recognize his role in the emergency. They're creating a special commendation for air traffic control personnel who provide exceptional assistance during emergencies, he explained. You and I are apparently going to be the first recipients. Do I have to give a speech? Sarah asked, dreading the thought of more public attention. Probably. But the good news is that it gives us a platform to talk about the real lessons from this incident: crew resource management, emergency communication protocols, the importance of staying calm under pressure. Sarah appreciated Hendricks' perspective on the broader implications of their experience. Unlike the media, which focused on the drama and heroics, he understood the technical and procedural aspects that could actually improve aviation safety. I've been thinking about something, Sarah told him. What if there had been multiple aircraft with the same problem? If this contamination had affected several flights simultaneously? That's a sobering thought, Hendricks replied. Air traffic control doesn't have procedures for handling multiple emergency landings by untrained passengers. We barely had the resources to manage your single aircraft. The conversation highlighted one of the most disturbing aspects of the incident: how vulnerable the aviation system was to seemingly minor failures in seemingly unrelated areas. Food safety protocols in a catering facility had nearly caused a catastrophic airline accident, and only extraordinary luck had prevented a tragedy. Marcus had been following online discussions among professional pilots about the implications of Sarah's successful landing. The aviation community was divided between those who saw it as proof that modern aircraft were extremely forgiving, and those who worried it might lead to complacency about pilot training standards. Some guys are saying this proves that autopilot systems are so advanced that anyone can fly an airliner, Marcus told her. Others are pointing out that you had perfect weather, a long runway, and a very experienced controller talking you through every step. What do you think? Sarah asked. I think you did something that shouldn't have been possible, and we're all incredibly lucky it worked out. But I also think people are drawing the wrong conclusions if they think this means flying is easy. That evening, as Sarah sat by the window watching aircraft take off and land at Anchorage International Airport, she reflected on how her perception of aviation had changed. Before the emergency, she had been a nervous passenger who trusted in systems and procedures she didn't understand. Now she had intimate knowledge of how aircraft responded to control inputs, how complex the coordination between pilots and air traffic control really was, and how many things had to go right for every flight to arrive safely. The experience had given her a profound respect for the skill and responsibility that commercial pilots carried, but it had also revealed the resilience and adaptability of both the aircraft and the people who operated them. In the most extreme circumstances imaginable, the system had worked not perfectly, but well enough to save 247 lives. As she prepared for bed, Sarah realized that the most challenging part of this experience might still lie ahead. Returning to normal life after becoming an international news story would require its own kind of navigation skills, and the lessons she had learned about aviation might prove useful in managing the media attention and public scrutiny that awaited them back in Seattle. The first-class cabin of Alaska Airlines Flight 127 from Anchorage to Seattle felt surreal to Sarah as she settled into her seat. 4 days earlier, she had been landing a Boeing 777 in an emergency. Now she was a passenger again, trying to process the whirlwind of events that had made her an unlikely celebrity. Marcus sat beside her, still moving somewhat slowly but clearly on the mend. His color had returned to normal, and the slight tremor in his hands was barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. The doctors had been right about his recovery timeline. The botulinum toxin was working its way out of his system, leaving behind only the memory of how close they had all come to disaster. "Are you nervous about flying?" Marcus asked as they taxied for takeoff, noting how intently Sarah was watching the flight attendant's safety demonstration. "Not nervous exactly," Sarah replied. "But I'm seeing everything differently now. I understand what all those sounds mean, what the pilots are doing up front, how many things have to work perfectly for this to be routine." The takeoff was smooth, and as they climbed through the clouds over Anchorage, Sarah found herself automatically noting their altitude, airspeed, and rate of climb. The instruments she had struggled to understand just days ago now made intuitive sense, as if the crisis had rewired her brain to process aviation information. "The FAA wants to interview you when we get back to Seattle," Marcus mentioned, scrolling through emails on his phone. "They're developing new emergency procedures based on what happened." "What kind of procedures?" "Enhanced communication protocols between air traffic control and passengers in extreme emergencies. Simplified backup flight controls that could be operated by untrained personnel. Better training for flight attendants in basic aircraft operation." Sarah nodded, though she wondered if bureaucratic procedures could really capture the chaos and uncertainty of their actual experience. The emergency hadn't unfolded according to any manual or checklist. It had been a series of improvised decisions made under extreme pressure with incomplete information. Her phone buzzed with another interview request, this one from 60 Minutes. She declined it without reading the details, as she had done with dozens of similar requests over the past 4 days. The media attention was becoming overwhelming, and she was beginning to understand why some people chose to remain anonymous. "After extraordinary events, Pacific Airways wants to offer you a job," Marcus said, looking up from his email with amusement. "Doing what?" "I'm not qualified to do anything in aviation." "Public relations, apparently. They think having you as a spokesperson would be good for their safety image." Sarah laughed. "That's probably the last job I'd want. Imagine having to explain to passengers that their airline's safety record includes a flight where both pilots were poisoned and an untrained passenger had to land the plane." The flight attendant, a woman about Janet Mills' age, stopped by their seats to check on them. Her name tag read Linda Peterson, and she had the professional bearing of someone who had been working international routes for decades. "Excuse me," Linda said quietly, "but are you the couple from Flight 447? Sarah nodded reluctantly, bracing for another round of questions about the emergency landing. "I just wanted to say thank you," Linda continued. "What you did. It changes how we think about our jobs. Knowing that passengers and crew can work together in extreme situations, that there are options even when everything goes wrong, it makes us all feel a little safer up here." The comment surprised Sarah. She had been thinking about the incident, primarily in terms of luck and extraordinary circumstances. But Linda was right that it demonstrated the possibility of successful improvisation when normal procedures failed. "I had a lot of help," Sarah replied. "Captain Hendricks, Janet Mills, Dr. Warren, I couldn't have done anything without them." "But you were the one who had to actually fly the airplane," Linda pointed out. "That took courage we don't usually ask of passengers." As they approached Seattle, Sarah could see the familiar landmarks of Puget Sound spread out below them, the Space Needle, Elliott Bay, the ferry terminals where she and Marcus had taken so many weekend trips during their courtship. The sight of home was comforting after the intensity of the past few days, but she knew their life in Seattle would be different now. The media circus was waiting for them at SeaTac Airport. Despite Pacific Airways' attempts to coordinate a discreet arrival, news crews had positioned themselves throughout the terminal, and photographers with long lenses were capturing images of passengers deplaning from every Alaska Airlines flight. "Back exit," Marcus suggested, nodding toward the jet bridge's service door. Linda Peterson had anticipated this problem and quietly guided them through the crew exit, where a Pacific Airways representative was waiting with a car. The drive home To Bellevue took them through familiar neighborhoods that looked different somehow, as if Sarah's changed perspective on aviation had altered her view of everything else as well. The houses, the traffic, the routine activities of suburban life all seemed more fragile and precious after experiencing how quickly normal circumstances could become life-threatening. Their house was surrounded by news vans and reporters, forcing them to park several blocks away and approach through their neighbor's backyard. The media attention was more invasive than Sarah had anticipated, and she began to understand why some people disappeared from public view after traumatic events. "We need to hire a publicist," Marcus said as they watched camera crews from their living room window. "This isn't going away anytime soon." "I don't want to be famous for this," Sarah replied. "I want to go back to work at the museum and have people forget this ever happened." But even as she said it, Sarah knew that option wasn't available. The story had become too big, the implications too significant for the aviation industry. She was going to be associated with Flight 447 for the rest of her life, whether she embraced that role or not. 6 weeks after the emergency landing, Sarah found herself sitting at a witness table in a congressional hearing room, facing a panel of senators and representatives who were investigating aviation safety procedures. The ornate chamber, with its high ceilings and formal atmosphere, felt like a theatrical stage, which in many ways it was. Senator Patricia Williams of Washington State, the committee chairwoman, opened the hearing with a statement that managed to be both complimentary and ominous. Mrs. Chen's heroic actions on Pacific Airways Flight 447 saved 247 lives, but they also revealed serious gaps in our aviation safety system that demand immediate attention. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for this testimony with help from Pacific Airways' legal team, the NTSB investigators, and a consultant who specialized in congressional appearances. The key, they had told her, was to be factual, concise, and avoid speculation about policy recommendations that were outside her expertise. "Mrs. Chen," Senator Williams began, "can you describe for the committee the moment you realized you might have to land the aircraft yourself?" Sarah leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady despite the intimidating setting. It became clear that Captain Rodriguez was incapacitated, and First Officer Chen, my husband, was showing similar symptoms. Flight attendant Mills had checked the passenger manifest for other qualified pilots, and there were none aboard. At that point, what was your assessment of your qualifications to attempt such a landing? "I had no qualifications whatsoever," Sarah replied honestly. "I had never flown any aircraft, never taken a flying lesson, never even used a flight simulator. My only aviation knowledge came from conversations with my husband over our 10 years of marriage." Senator Robert Hayes of Texas, a former Air Force pilot, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Mrs. Chen, are you saying that a completely untrained passenger was able to successfully land a Boeing 777 solely through radio instruction?" "That's correct, Senator. Captain Hendricks from Alaska Airlines provided step-by-step guidance from the Anchorage approach control facility. The aircraft's autopilot systems handled most of the navigation and speed control. I was essentially following instructions while the technology did the actual flying until the final approach." "But you did manually control the aircraft during the landing itself? For the last few hundred feet, yes. Captain Hendricks talked me through disconnecting the autopilot and making the control inputs necessary for touchdown." Representative Maria Santos of California asked the question Sarah had been dreading. "Given that you were successful with minimal training, does this suggest that current pilot certification requirements are excessive?" Sarah had anticipated this line of questioning and had a carefully prepared response. "Absolutely not, Representative Santos. I succeeded because of extraordinary circumstances, perfect weather, a long runway, exceptional guidance from an experienced pilot, and modern aircraft systems that are designed to be forgiving. Any change in those conditions could have resulted in catastrophe. But surely your experience demonstrates that aviation is less complex than the industry claims. With respect, I believe it demonstrates the opposite. The complexity of what Captain Rodriguez and my husband do routinely became apparent to me only when I had to attempt it myself. Every flight depends on their expertise, judgment, and ability to handle situations that can't be programmed into. Autopilot systems. Senator Williams consulted her notes. The NTSB investigation identified the catering facility's safety violations as the root cause of this incident. What's your opinion on the oversight of aviation food service providers? I'm not qualified to assess regulatory policies, Sarah replied carefully. But as a passenger, I would expect that any company providing food service to aircraft crews would be held to the highest safety standards. The contamination that affected Flight 447 could have caused a catastrophic accident if circumstances had been different. Representative James Mitchell of Florida, who had been silent through most of the hearing, finally spoke up. Mrs. Chen, some aviation experts have suggested that your successful landing was essentially impossible. How do you respond to that assessment? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think they're right that it shouldn't have been possible. I was extremely fortunate in every aspect of the situation: the aircraft's condition, the weather, the availability of Captain Hendricks to provide guidance, the skill of the flight attendants in managing the cabin during the emergency. If any of those factors had been different, we would likely be discussing a tragedy rather than a successful outcome. So you don't recommend that other passengers attempt similar actions in comparable emergencies? I would recommend that passengers follow the instructions of trained crew members and aviation professionals, as I did. Captain Hendricks made the critical decisions about how to handle the emergency. I was simply the person available to implement his instructions. The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering everything from crew training requirements to food safety protocols to emergency communication procedures. Sarah answered each question as honestly as possible while avoiding the policy prescriptions that the committee members seemed to be seeking. During a break, Agent Martinez from the NTSB pulled Sarah aside. You're handling this well. They're trying to get you to endorse specific regulatory changes, but your role is to provide factual testimony about what happened. It feels like they want me to be either a hero who proves the system works or victim who demonstrates that it's broken, Sarah replied. But the reality is more complicated than either narrative. That's exactly right. Your experience was unique, and drawing broad policy conclusions from a single incident would be problematic. When the hearing resumed, Senator Williams asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Mrs. Chen, what do you think the aviation industry should learn from your experience? Sarah had been thinking about this question for weeks, and her answer reflected both her newfound understanding of aviation complexity and her appreciation for the human factors that had made their survival possible. I think the most important lesson is about the value of preparation and teamwork under pressure. Captain Hendricks was able to guide me through the emergency because of his extensive experience and training. Flight attendant Mills managed the cabin crisis because of her professional skills. Dr. Warren diagnosed the medical emergency because of her expertise. My husband and Captain Rodriguez had put the aircraft in a stable condition before they became incapacitated, which gave us time to develop solutions. She paused, looking around the hearing room at the senators and representatives who would ultimately decide on regulatory changes, based partly on her testimony. The system worked not because it was simple or foolproof, but because highly trained professionals were able to adapt their expertise to an unprecedented situation. I think that argues for continued emphasis on training, experience, and the kind of crew resource management that enables people to work together effectively during emergencies. Senator Williams nodded approvingly. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. Your testimony has been both illuminating and inspiring. As Sarah left the hearing room, She realized that her role in the Flight 447 story was far from over. The congressional testimony would influence regulatory changes that affected the entire aviation industry, and her words would be quoted in policy debates for years to come. The responsibility was sobering. Her 15 minutes of fame had evolved into a lifetime commitment to aviation safety advocacy. 1 year after Flight 447's emergency landing, Sarah stood in the cockpit of a Boeing 737 at Boeing Field in Seattle, her hands on the controls of an aircraft for the first time since that terrifying night over the North Pacific. The difference was that this time, she was there voluntarily, as a student pilot working toward her private pilot's license. Her instructor, Captain Janet Rodriguez, no relation to the Pacific Airways captain, observed from the right seat as Sarah practiced basic maneuvers in the simulator. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Sarah was now learning to fly properly after her accidental success with a much larger and more complex aircraft. "Altitude looks good. Airspeed is stable," Janet noted as Sarah executed a standard rate turn. "You have excellent feel for the controls. That's unusual for someone with your background. I think the experience on Flight 447 gave me an intuitive understanding of how aircraft respond to control inputs," Sarah replied, adjusting their heading with small movements of the yoke. "It's like muscle memory from the most intense flight lesson imaginable." The decision to learn to fly had come gradually over the months following the congressional hearing. Sarah had found herself drawn back to aviation, not out of any desire to relive the emergency, but from genuine fascination with the technical and human factors that made flight possible. Marcus had been initially surprised, then supportive, and finally enthusiastic about her decision to pursue pilot training. Ground control, Cessna 24319, requesting taxi for departure. Sarah transmitted, handling the radio communications with growing confidence. Cessna 319, ground control, taxi to runway 14 left via Alpha 4. Contact tower when ready for departure. The transition from crisis management to normal flight training had been challenging in unexpected ways. During the emergency, adrenaline and desperate circumstances had focused her attention completely on immediate survival. Learning to fly under routine conditions required a different kind of concentration, more methodical, less intense, but equally demanding. "You're cleared for takeoff," Janet announced after Sarah had completed her pre-flight checklist and received permission from the tower. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the Cessna 172 accelerate down the runway. The sensation was familiar from her experience in the Boeing 777, but the scale was completely different. Where the commercial airliner had been a massive, complex machine requiring careful management, the small training aircraft responded immediately and intuitively to her control inputs. "Rotate," Janet called out as they reached takeoff speed. Sarah pulled back on the yoke, and the Cessna lifted smoothly into the clear Seattle morning. The city spread out below them, Elliott Bay, the ferry terminals, the familiar landmarks she had seen from airline windows hundreds of times, but never from the pilot's seat of a small aircraft. "How does it feel?" Janet asked as they climbed through 2,000 feet. "Different from what I expected," Sarah replied honestly. "During the emergency, everything felt overwhelming and urgent. This feels manageable, like something I can actually learn to do well." The past year had brought significant changes to both Sarah's and Marcus's lives. The media attention had gradually diminished, though Sarah still received occasional interview requests and speaking invitations. She had given presentations at aviation safety conferences, pilot training seminars, and university psychology departments studying performance under extreme stress. Marcus had returned to flying for Pacific Airways 6 months after the incident. Following extensive medical examinations and recertification procedures, the airline had initially offered him a promotion to captain, but he had declined, preferring to continue as a first officer, while he regained complete confidence in his abilities. "The strangest thing," Marcus had told her, "is that I'm more aware now of how much passengers trust us. Before Flight 447, flying was just my job, technical procedures, and routine operations. Now I think about the fact that every passenger is depending on my expertise and judgment." Their relationship had also evolved in unexpected ways. The shared trauma of the emergency had deepened their bond, but it had also changed their dynamic. Sarah was no longer simply the pilot's wife. She had become someone with her own aviation expertise and perspective on the industry that employed her husband. "Let's practice some steep turns," Janet suggested, bringing Sarah's attention back to the training flight. 45 degrees of bank, maintain altitude. Sarah rolled the Cessna into a steep left turn, feeling the increased G-forces press her into her seat. The maneuver required precise coordination of aileron, rudder, and elevator inputs, exactly the kind of control coordination she had struggled with during the emergency landing, but was now learning systematically. "Good, now recover to level flight and try it to the right." As Sarah completed the training maneuvers, she reflected on how much her understanding of aviation had expanded since that night over the Pacific. The emergency had given her an intense but narrow exposure to flying, just enough knowledge to survive a specific crisis. Proper flight training was providing the broader foundation that made aviation comprehensible as a discipline rather than a series of emergency procedures. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Hendricks, who had become a friend and mentor over the past year. He was now involved in developing new training protocols for air traffic controllers dealing with passenger pilot emergencies, based partly on their shared experience with Flight 447. "Any word on the congressional committees? Final recommendations?" The message read. Sarah replied while Janet took control of the aircraft. "Vote scheduled for next week. Looks like enhanced crew training and improved food safety oversight will pass." The passenger pilot training proposal got dropped. That last point had been a relief to Sarah. Some committee members had proposed mandatory basic flight training for frequent flyers or flight attendants, but the aviation industry had successfully argued that such measures would be costly and of limited value. Sarah agreed her successful landing had been possible only because of extraordinary circumstances that were unlikely to be replicated. Seattle approach, Cessna 24319, requesting return to Boeing Field. Janet transmitted as they completed the training sequence. Cessna 319, Seattle approach, turn right heading 180, descend and maintain 3000. Contact Boeing Field Tower on 119.9. The approach and landing procedures were routine now, though Sarah still felt a flutter of anxiety during the final approach phase. Landing remained the most challenging aspect of flying for her, requiring precise timing and coordination that couldn't be automated or simplified. "Nice landing," Janet commented as Sarah brought the Cessna to a smooth touchdown on runway 14 left. "You're definitely ready for your check ride next month." The prospect of earning her private pilot's license was both exciting and daunting. Sarah had discovered a genuine aptitude for flying, but she was also acutely aware of the vast difference between recreational piloting and the commercial aviation career that had defined Marcus's life. "Have you thought about what you want to do after you get your license?" Janet asked as they taxied back to the flight school. "Marcus wants me to get my instrument rating, maybe even work toward a commercial license. But I think I'm more interested in the advocacy side, working on aviation safety issues, maybe teaching people about the realities of commercial flight." The speaking engagements and safety conferences had revealed Sarah's unexpected talent for public communication about complex technical subjects. Her unique perspective as both a survivor of an aviation emergency and a new pilot gave her credibility, with audiences ranging from nervous passengers to Experienced aviation professionals. As they secured the aircraft and completed the post-flight paperwork, Sarah's phone rang with a call from Dr. Warren, who had remained in touch throughout the year. "Sarah, I have some interesting news," Dr. Warren said. "The New England Journal of Medicine wants to publish our case study on the neurological effects of botulinum poisoning in aviation. Your husband's recovery data has provided valuable insights into treatment protocols." "That's wonderful." "Marcus will be pleased to know his medical crisis contributed to scientific knowledge. There's also something else. I've been invited to speak at the International Aviation Medicine Conference next month, and they've specifically requested that you present alongside me. Are you interested?" Sarah considered the invitation. The past year had taught her that her role in the Flight 447 story carried ongoing responsibilities, not just to satisfy media curiosity, but to contribute meaningfully to aviation safety and emergency preparedness. "I'd be honored," she replied. "What would you want me to focus on?" "The human factors aspects, decision-making under extreme stress, the importance of clear communication during emergencies, how untrained individuals can contribute to successful outcomes when properly guided." As Sarah drove home from the flight school, she reflected on how completely her life had changed since that ordinary Tuesday morning when she had worried about her burgundy dress wrinkling during the flight to Tokyo. The emergency landing had thrust her into a world she never could have imagined: congressional hearings, international conferences, flight training, and ongoing involvement in aviation safety research. But perhaps the most significant change was her newfound appreciation for the complexity and humanity of commercial aviation. Every flight was now an opportunity to observe the intricate coordination between pilots, air traffic controllers, flight attendants, and ground personnel that made routine air travel possible. She understood viscerally that aviation safety wasn't a matter of perfect technology or foolproof procedures, but of skilled professionals working together to manage an inherently challenging environment. Marcus was waiting for her when she arrived home, having just returned from a 3-day trip to Frankfurt. His recovery from the botulinum poisoning was complete, and he had regained all of his flight privileges, but Sarah could see that the experience had changed him as well. "How was the lesson?" he asked, settling beside her on the couch. "Good. Janet thinks I'm ready for the Czech ride next month." "Are you nervous about it?" Sarah considered the question. "A little, but not the way I was nervous about landing the 777. This feels like something I can prepare for and master through normal training, rather than something I have to improvise under impossible circumstances." Marcus smiled. "That's the difference between emergency procedures and normal operations. One requires split-second decisions with incomplete information. The other allows for careful preparation and systematic execution." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky over Puget Sound in shades of orange and pink. In the distance, Sarah could see the contrails of airliners arriving and departing from SeaTac Airport, each one carrying passengers who trusted in the expertise and professionalism of crews, like the one that had brought Flight 447 safely to Anchorage. "Do you ever regret getting involved in all this?" Marcus asked. "The hearings, the conferences, the media attention?" Sarah thought about the question carefully. The past year had been challenging in ways she never could have anticipated, but it had also been deeply meaningful. "No," she replied finally. "I think we have a responsibility to share what we learned. If our experience can prevent even one similar emergency, or help one crew handle a crisis more effectively, then everything we've been through has been worthwhile." As they prepared for bed, Sarah checked her email one final time and found a message that brought the year full circle. It was from Janet Mills, the flight attendant who had helped manage the crisis aboard Flight 447. "Sarah," the message read, "I wanted you to know that I've been selected to help develop new emergency procedures training for flight attendants. The program will include basic aircraft systems knowledge and enhanced communication, protocols for passenger-assisted emergencies. Your experience has literally changed how we train crew members throughout the industry. Thank you for showing us what's possible when people work together under impossible circumstances. Sarah smiled as she closed her laptop. The emergency landing had been terrifying, the aftermath overwhelming, but the long-term impact was deeply satisfying. Flight 447 had become more than a survival story. It had become a catalyst for meaningful improvements in aviation, safety and emergency preparedness. The Boeing 777 touched down smoothly at Tokyo Narita Airport. Exactly 5 years to the day after Pacific Airways Flight 447's emergency diversion to Anchorage. Sarah watched from the passenger cabin as the aircraft taxied to the gate, completing the journey that had been interrupted so dramatically 5 years earlier. This time, she and Marcus were traveling as ordinary passengers on their 15th wedding anniversary trip, the celebration they had never quite managed to have after the emergency landing had derailed their original plans. But ordinary wasn't quite accurate anymore. Sarah now held a commercial pilot's license and had logged over 500 hours of flight time in various aircraft. Marcus had been promoted to captain and was flying Pacific Airways' newest routes to sustainable aviation, fuel demonstration flights. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tokyo," announced the captain over the intercom. "Local time is 2:30 p.m., and the weather is clear and sunny, perfect conditions for your stay in Japan." Sarah smiled at the routine nature of the announcement. 5 years ago, she had heard similar words during the most terrifying experience of her life. Now they represented nothing more than the successful completion of another routine commercial flight, exactly as they should. The passenger beside them, a young businessman who had struck up a conversation during the flight, looked at Sarah curiously. "Excuse me, but someone mentioned you were involved in some kind of aviation incident a few years ago?" Sarah glanced at Marcus, who nodded slightly. They had developed a standard response to such questions over the years. "My husband and I were aboard a flight that experienced an emergency," Sarah replied diplomatically. "It worked out fine, and we learned a lot about aviation safety from the experience." It was an understatement of epic proportions, but Sarah had learned that most people weren't really interested in the technical details or long-term implications of Flight 447. They wanted either a dramatic story about heroism and survival, or they wanted reassurance that commercial flying was safe. The truth that aviation safety depended on the complex interaction of technology, training, procedures, and human judgment was too nuanced for casual conversation. The young businessman seemed satisfied with her response and returned to gathering his belongings as the aircraft came to a stop at the gate. Sarah and Marcus waited for the initial rush of deplaning passengers to clear before making their way to the exit. "Thank you for flying with us today," said the flight attendant at the door, a woman about Janet Mills' age with the same professional bearing that Sarah had come to associate with experienced international crew members. As they walked through the jet bridge into Narita Airport, Sarah reflected on how much the aviation industry had changed since Flight 447. The incident had indeed catalyzed significant improvements in emergency procedures, crew training, and food safety protocols. But more importantly, it had contributed to a broader cultural shift toward acknowledging the human factors that made aviation safety possible. The catering company responsible for the botulinum contamination had gone out of business within months. As predicted, its executives had faced federal criminal charges, and the resulting civil settlements had run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. More significantly, the incident had led to industry-wide changes in food safety oversight and crew meal handling procedures. Pacific Airways had emerged from the crisis with an enhanced reputation for safety and crew professionalism, though the airline had also invested heavily in new emergency response training and passenger communication protocols. Marcus had been involved in developing some of these programs, drawing on his first-hand experience of the challenges faced by flight crews. During complex emergencies, Captain Hendricks had become something of a celebrity within the air traffic control community, speaking regularly at conferences and training seminars about emergency communication procedures. The protocols he had improvised during Flight 447 were now part of standard controller training at facilities around the world. Dr. Warren had published several papers on aviation toxicology and emergency medicine, establishing herself as a leading expert on in-flight medical emergencies. Her research on the neurological effects of botulinum poisoning had contributed to improved treatment protocols that had already saved lives in non-aviation contexts. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Flight 447 had been its influence on public understanding of aviation safety. Sarah's congressional testimony and subsequent speaking engagements had helped educate both policymakers and the policymakers and the policymakers general public about the complexity of commercial flight operations and the importance of maintaining high training standards for aviation professionals. Where to first? Marcus asked as they collected their luggage and prepared to enter Tokyo for the first time. Tsukiji Market, Sarah replied without hesitation. You promised me sushi from the actual fish market, and I've been waiting 5 years to collect on that promise. They took the train into central Tokyo, watching the city unfold through the windows as they traveled from the modern efficiency of Narita Airport to the organized chaos of the world's largest metropolitan area. The familiar rhythm of rail travel was soothing after the intensity of international flight, though Sarah found herself automatically noting their speed, direction, and the coordination required to move millions of people safely through the city's transportation network. Do you miss it? Marcus asked as they walked through the early morning crowds at Tsukiji Market, surrounded by the controlled frenzy of vendors preparing for the day's business. Miss what? The excitement, the media attention, being at the center of something important. Sarah considered the question as they sampled fresh tuna at a sushi counter that had been serving customers for over 60 years. The past 5 years had been fulfilling in many ways: her pilot training, the safety advocacy work, the satisfaction of contributing to meaningful improvements in aviation procedures. But Marcus was right that there had been something uniquely intense about being thrust into the center of an international story. I miss the sense of purpose, she replied finally. During the emergency and for months afterward, everything felt critically important. Every decision mattered, every conversation contributed to something larger than ourselves. And now I have a different kind of purpose. Teaching people to fly, working on safety research, helping others understand what really makes aviation work. It's less dramatic, but maybe more sustainable. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. His own relationship with their shared experience had evolved similarly over the years. The initial trauma and media attention had given way to a deeper appreciation for the professional responsibilities he carried as a commercial pilot. I think about our passengers differently now, he had told her recently. Not just as people to transport safely from point A to point B, but as individuals who are trusting their lives to my expertise and judgment. It makes the job more meaningful, but also more weighty. As they wandered through the market, sampling different vendors' offerings and watching the ancient rituals of commerce play out in one of the world's most modern cities, Sarah reflected on the unexpected ways that crisis could reshape a life. Flight 447 had been terrifying, but it had also opened doors to experiences and opportunities she never could have imagined. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Hendricks. Saw your interview in Aviation Week. Great points about the importance of realistic emergency training. Hope you're enjoying Tokyo. Sarah smiled and replied, Finally made it to Tsukiji Market. The sushi is worth waiting 5 years for. As they prepared to leave the market and explore more of Tokyo, Sarah realized that their anniversary trip represented more than just a delayed celebration or a return to interrupted plans. It was a symbol of how they had rebuilt their lives around a shared understanding of what really mattered, not the dramatic moments that captured headlines, but the daily choices and professional commitments that made modern life possible. Young businessman from their flight appeared at a nearby sushi counter, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the authentic Tokyo market experience. Sarah caught his eye and pointed him toward a vendor who spoke some English, then returned to her conversation with Marcus. "No regrets?" Marcus asked, echoing the question he had posed a year after the emergency. "None," Sarah replied firmly. "We survived something that should have killed us, learned things about ourselves and each other that we never would have discovered otherwise, and maybe contributed to making flying a little safer for everyone else. I'd call that a good trade-off." As they walked back toward the train station, Sarah noticed another Boeing 777 passing overhead, probably departing Narita for some distant destination. The sight no longer triggered memories of terror and desperation, but rather a quiet satisfaction in understanding the complexity and professionalism that made such routine miracles possible. 5 years after their emergency landing in Anchorage, Sarah and Marcus Chen had finally completed their journey to Tokyo. But more importantly, they had discovered that the most meaningful destinations were often the ones you never planned to visit, and the most valuable lessons came from experiences you never wanted to have. The story of Flight 447 would continue to influence aviation safety for years to come. But for Sarah and Marcus, it had become simply one chapter in a larger narrative about resilience, partnership, and the unexpected ways that ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary circumstances. As their train pulled away from Tsukiji, market toward the next adventure in their Tokyo exploration, Sarah closed her eyes and felt grateful for every routine, ordinary, wonderfully predictable moment of their journey, the kind of moments that were only possible because thousands of skilled professionals around the world were doing their jobs with competence, dedication, and the hard-won wisdom that came from understanding exactly how much was at stake every time an aircraft left the ground. Thank you for being part of this storytelling community. And remember, sometimes the most extraordinary chapters of our lives begin with the most ordinary moments. Subscribe now, and let's discover the next incredible story together.